Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to discuss firepower IPS tuning a little bit. By no means is this going to be like an all-inclusive video series on firepower. The reason being is because I'm actually helping develop a course for firepower with Pluralsight, and it should be out. The first one should be out today, and there's also a really good firepower course that's on there as well by Martin Brown. And this is kind of to explain like what a amp policy is, what the intrusion policy is, kind of like jumping into it for the first time. So I don't want to go over like the basics. This is actually this video idea kind of spawned from a customer who wanted to know more about how to optimize their rules. So I wanted to dig into the actual intrusion policy and explain kind of the logic and some of the things that you can do with it. So with that being said, I'm going to be looking at my lab, which has one existing intrusion policy, and that's applied to the existing access control policy. I'm going to show you some of the different things you can do with rules here. So when you first create a access control an intrusion policy, you have the option to create a base policy. That's the layer that goes at the bottom, and you can create, and tune things above that. So right now, the existing policy, then actually let me go back really quick. So I'm going to go back to my intrusion policy, and I'm going to create a new one just so you can see what that looks like. So when we create a policy, don't mind. When you create a policy, you have the option to create a base policy, and that base policy can be a couple different policies that are provided by the firepower system, and these are the rules that are in those policies are managed by Talos, which is Cisco's Security Intelligence Unit. So I'm just going to go ahead and name this Security Demo Intrusion 2. It's just going to be a second policy set when I'm actually digging into the policy later this video, you'll see why I created this. And let's go ahead and drop when in line. If you check that, that means that it can actually drop the packets when an event happens. If you have a rule that's basically set to drop an event. So let's go ahead and create and edit this policy. I'll save it afterwards. We're not going to actually edit from here because this isn't the one that's actually assigned to my firewall that's in my lab, but it's just more of show you what this looks like from a perspective. So as you can see here, the base policy of balance and security connectivity has 10,338 rules enabled. 94 of those are to generate events, and 10,244 are to drop and generate events. So let's say if I care more about connectivity over security instead of the balance, and I just want everything to go as fast as possible and inspect less, we can go ahead and change that base policy. And you can see here, the only thing that changes with that is the enabled rules. So just give it one moment. And one thing to also note is that these enabled rules can change when you do an update of the SRUs. So when Talos issues an update and you download it, that actually can affect this base policy. Sorry if you hear in the background a car zoom by. So as you can see here, now the policy has 507 enabled rules, so it's much less. So we're just going to go back to balance security and connectivity, and I'm going to commit the changes and save this, and we're going to ignore this for half of this video. But we will come back to it because I'll show you what I mean when we dig into a configuration a little bit later. So we'll commit this change, don't need to leave a description, and we're going to edit the existing one, the existing policy that's currently applied to my FTD firewall. Okay, so this is the policy that's currently assigned to my FTD firewall. Right now it's just very basic. It's got the balance policy and nothing else. A couple things I want to kind of go over really quickly with you is you can actually dig into what the rules are and search for rule configuration based on state, what's configured as far as the state's concerned, which ones I have currently configured for drop and generate, which ones are disabled, which ones are configured to generate events. This little filter thing on the left here is just really useful for that. If you've used firepower recommendations, you can actually see, filter by the recommendations. I'm not using recommendations right now, but we will shortly. If you want to do look at based on like how it's configured for thresholds and suppression. If I wanted to dig into a very specific, let me clear this filter really quickly. If I wanted to dig into like a specific SID, I can actually look it up by number. Or if I wanted to actually just search for a SID, you know, something in the name of the SID, or in the name of the actual intrusion rule, I can do a search for ICMP and see everything that's got ICMP set up. If I wanted to, you know, look at any rule, let's look at, let's find a good one really quickly, like maybe one of the rule updates, recent rule updates. So here I can go ahead and, if I wanted to see like, why is this rule created? Why is it dropping traffic? You know, what is it hoping to mitigate? I can highlight the rule and click show details to determine, am I going to, is it something that I want to enable or not? So if I've already enabled it, or there's a rule configured or anything configured for it, actually can see if there's anything additionally that I configured. So in this case, if I scroll down here, you see the actual raw snort rule, which if you can read that, that's awesome. You can also see references like rule documentation that'll take you to third-party sites. So this one's a Snort site, this one's security focus, the CVE, and website references. So it gives you a little bit more detail about this this rule and how it was created. So you get a little bit more detail on that if you need to dig in and say, hey, why is this rule important? And if you want to see which Snort rule update this was downloaded on and when the download was done, let's say this is something that was applied to your base policy and you started seeing drops from it, you can see when that actual those rules were downloaded. So with that being said, that these Snort, those are kind of the like table stakes, like how to do a search for rules in here. You can go to any. The next thing I want to kind of explain before we move on is policy layers. So let me go ahead and bring my whiteboard up and talk about how policy layers present themselves. So in an intrusion policy, you start out with two things. You start out with a base policy, which is the one that you decide. It could be that pre-filled Talos policy, or you could actually have a intrusion policy that has a base policy based off of what another intrusion policy. So if you create like if you create kind of a golden, golden intrusion policy, like this guy here, you think is perfect. It's the minimum of what you want to be configured and protecting when you create a new intrusion policy and apply it to a bunch of firewalls or IPS systems out there. You can go ahead and use that as your base, not just use the pre-filled ones or pre-created ones that Talos created for you. The other thing that comes on Firepower is My Changes layer. So that's one that any changes you make by default will go there to rules. And based on that, if there's a policy, like for example, if you decide that there's a base policy saying that, SID, the SID 4888 is, set to block traffic, dropped packets in the base policy, but you decide to disable that rule up above in a higher level, you can go ahead and do so. And the way that Firepower evaluates these rules is that it looks at the topmost layer first. So if the SID is disabled, if it's defined as dropping traffic or generating events, it'll basically look at the first layer for that SID first and make that decision based on that. If nothing's defined in that layer, then it goes and looks back, at each layer underneath. So by default, you have these two layers that are set up, My Changes and base policy. When you do a Snort rule update, the Snort rule update it pushes the updates to the base policy only. Depending on which base policy you have, it could have certain new changes set to block. It could be disabled, or it could be just generating events, depending on which base policy that you have set up. But there's a way to test out those things. So if you don't want to just have it apply to that base policy, or if you want to, to evaluate that by testing it first, there's a way to do that, and I'm going to show you in this video. The other thing is Firepower has the ability to make recommendations based off the network discovery data that it sees moving through your network. So if you decide, if you wanted to see, if you had Windows XP and Windows 7 machines in there, it'll look at, based on the real live traffic going through Firepower, these are the type of devices you have out there. Here's the versions that we think that these devices are in, and these are the vulnerabilities that we see based on those versions and the OS and the applications. So here are the rules that we recommend to enable. So that's a good way to like kind of make up recommended policy changes based off of what's actually being seen in your environment. For example, if you don't have any Linux hosts in there, there's no reason to have a bunch of policy or a bunch of rules enabled that look at Linux traffic or Linux vulnerabilities. So when it comes to policy layers, you can edit everything above here. Oh, hold on just a moment. I'm going to have to pause my video because my cat started meowing in the background, so I need to put him out for a second. So everything above Firepower and base policy can be configured. You can add as many layers as you want, and I'll show you as we're configuring here how this would be useful. When it comes to the Firepower recommendations and the base policy, you can't directly alter those. But as I explained before, you don't really need to, because if there's something here that you don't like that's enabled or not enabled, you can go ahead and make changes to these top layers, and those rules are going to be evaluated first. So with that being said, there's also another thing in there that you can actually create. So when you create layers, you can actually put a little marker on one that says it's a shared layer if you want to have one layer that you can use between different intrusion policies. And when you do that, you can actually, if you mark it as a shared layer, you can use it in other intrusion policies when you add the layer there. The only problem with this is when you need to make a change to a shared layer, you can't do it in the policy that it's being shared to. Like right here, it becomes uneditable. You have to actually do it in the original policy where you created it from. So it's not as useful as one would think. And honestly, I don't see many people in production doing it this way. Usually what they prefer is if you wanted to create something, a policy that you could use between different intrusion policies, what you could do is just create kind of like a golden template policy over here. So this is like your golden template, and it could have your base policy or your base layer plus the custom things that you want to change, my changes, and then you can just have that instead of using one of the predefined Talos recommendations or starting out with no rules, what you can do is you can just use your golden template as the base policy, and it would use the Talos recommendations that you prefer to use plus the custom changes. And that's just an easier way to share between different policies, and it's a lot easier to manage because the only thing you need to keep a track of is that golden template. You don't need to figure out where that shared layer came from and which policy you have to configure to change it. It's all kind of neatly organized somewhere else. So that being said, let's go ahead and dig into this policy creation really quickly. And bear in mind, I do this mostly in one take, so I'm not doing a lot of editing here. I'm just going to kind of show you some of the tricks and tips of kind of optimizing this policy a little bit more. So here, this is kind of a fresh config. Here's my base policy, and its balanced security rules. In this case, we can see everything that's here, but I can't make any changes to it because it's the base policy. And then we've got my changes above where I can actually make changes to any of the rules here. So I'm going to hide these details, and I can make changes. I can change the rule state and do other things. Now, when it comes to the Firepower recommendations, we can also add those here. And the customer specifically that I'm making this video towards, but I'm also sharing it for the world to see, he wanted to potentially use Firepower recommendations, but he didn't want to just apply them first and God knows what happens. So I wanted to show how to use things like, Snort rule updates and firepower rule recommendations, how to test them out first, so to speak. So when you go to firepower recommendations, you can go to advanced settings and define if there's only certain networks or subnets that you want to apply, create recommendations for. Maybe it's your user subnet, or maybe it's for like only server subnets. But I'm going to just kind of leave it blank. And you can decide how much, which rule recommendations, like how much overhead you want to potentially have on these rules. I'm just going to max it out and say generate and use recommendations. It gives me kind of a summary of which rules are enabled and disabled, and it creates a new it's going to create a new policy layer here, which you'll see shortly. Let me just go ahead and pull up my pen on this guy. So right here, we're going to see a new policy layer being created. And again, like I said before, you can't actually make changes to that policy layer, so we're going to have to get a little creative on how we're going to test out these recommendations. So just give it a minute while it goes through the host data and the vulnerability data and determines what are the recommendations that we should be using. All right, so now we see there's 105 rules that have been set to generate events based on the recommendations, and 461 rules set to drop and generate events. And then 35,777 rules were set to disable. So what if we want to, before we go into our, have our environment blocking rules, we want to test these out and see how accurate they are, or if there's a lot of false positives. How do we test that? Because we can't make any changes to the firewall recommendations. You're just kind of stuck here going, it's all grayed out. Well, the answer would be in policy layers. So if I wanted to test out a new firewall, the new firewall recommendations, I would click on policy layers and then click add layer. This is going to be firepower recommendations test. And remember, 461 rules recommended to block. That's just the number that we're going to keep in mind when we're creating this, because you're going to see exactly how I do this. So if I want to go into the rules, and I would use again, I can go to just see all rules if I wanted to. I can go to rule content. I can do searches based on names or SIDs. But in this case, I'm going to go to recommendations and go for everything that was recommended to drop and generate events. And one thing you'll notice is when you're using layers, there's you can see when a rule has been set above or below. In this case, we see that these rules have been set below this layer, and they've been set to drop and generate events. So in this case, since this layer is above firepower recommendations, I'm going to go ahead and change this to generate events. Since this layer is above firepower recommendations, it will override those changes below. And see, it set 461 rules, the exact amount, because they're the exact rules from the firepower recommendations. So let's say you apply this and you wait a week. You've checked to make sure that there's not a lot of false positives, there's not a lot of false negatives, you're liking how these rules are working. Do you just keep this layer forever? No, the truth is you would not keep this forever, because every time there's recommendations or new updates, this can get, tons more layers going. So there's a cool way to just kind of merge these with my changes. So you can go, all you would have to do is see this button right here that says merge the layer down. It will combine the rules down with my changes and override for those 461 rules, my changes. So as you can see here, it flattens the layer and just kind of condenses it to one. Also, the thing about my changes, you can change the name of this if you don't like it. Right here, it's not an issue. And there's certain detections you can also do on here. So another thing, if I wanted to kind of test out, show you how to use these rules and kind of override rules, here's a cool one you can do. So there's some general testing you can do, like for example, sensitive data detection. That's where we can test if clear text certain information is sent, not only clear text, but if you wanted to have like decryption on firepower looking for certain numbers, you can also do that too. So sensitive data detection is like a poor man's DLP. It's the best way I can phrase it because it's looking for common PI information, like private information, like credit card numbers, email addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers with and without dashes. And and it looks for it in certain protocol data. You can change that as well, but I'm just kind of keeping this at the default. You have to first enable this, and then you have to enable the rule inside of Firepower. So in this case, I'm going to test this and show you how it looks when we do this. The threshold is going to be one number because I'm going for triggering the rule. By default, it obscures everything except the last four numbers of the credit card or social security number. I'm going to uncheck that, and that basically means it's going to actually show it in the raw packet data. So don't try this at home or in production, because if you do that, you might be farming social security numbers and credit card numbers, and there might be some legal ramifications. So first we enable it, and then we have to enable the Snort rules that are specific to this. So in this case, sensitive data. I know that I've tested this enough times to know. So I'm going to go ahead and create a rule basically saying generate event from this. And just so you can see, these are some of the different rules you can create or certain settings for this policy layer. You can have a global rule threshold, so only alert X amount of times when a rule is violated in X amount of time. So like one time in 60 seconds. If you only want one event in 60 seconds instead of kind of like maxing out your logs, I think the global threshold rule by default is one count for every 16 seconds, and it's tracking by destination. But I'm not going to futz with that. I'm just kind of showing you what that is. You can actually specify certain SNMP alerting and syslog alerting. You can do it by policy layer, or you can do global configuration. So if you did this, you can go ahead and wait for it to enable, and you can configure the actual SNMP server. Again, I'm going to go back to disable because I'm not going to configure that. But first, you would enable the external responses, and you can also enable it by rule once you define what that is. So I can sit there and say, once I've defined what my SNMP or syslog server is, I can sit there and add an SNMP alert for that when that specific rule is triggered. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and commit these changes and apply it to my firewall. And then I'm going to go ahead and try to trigger the alert for social security numbers. I have basically a fake social security number sitting on a text file on an FTP server. I'm not going to even bother with decrypting. I'm just going to get it from clear text and kind of show what it looks like from a firepower intrusion rule. All right, now that that's deployed, let's go ahead and pull up our browser and go ahead and trigger this rule. So let's go over here real quick. I think I have everything I deleted all the existing events before because I kind of wanted this to be clean. So let's go ahead and trigger this rule. So I'm going to go to the FTP server and just browse to it through clear text, and I'm going to pull up the social security numbers. Oh no, bad. So let's go ahead and refresh this window, and we should see that pulling up now. And if we drill down, and one was with dashes and without dashes, as you can see here, I've hit both rules. If I want to dig down to the actual clear text packet, I can go ahead and do so. And that's where you can see where it can be a little dangerous if you don't do the masking, because it could, you could pretty much farm social security numbers or credit cards this way. So let's go ahead and see the plain text, packet text. So yeah, so those are my fake social security numbers right there. So just bear in mind when you're doing that, that's something important to be cognizant of. So let's go back to my events really quickly, and I'm going to go ahead and delete those events. And let's go back to the policy as well. I'm going to delete these because that's not really important. I just wanted to kind of show you the importance. If you do use sensitive data and you want to mask that, probably a good idea. So let's go back to the policy, and I'm going to create a policy layer above the one that we just created, and in that policy layer I'm going to disable the rule for sensitive data detection. And you'll see that since that layer is above this layer, it overrides for that specific rule that whatever the policy is in my changes layer. So let's go to policy layers, and we'll add a layer. This is going to be no sensitive data detection. The only thing I'm going to change here is I'm just going to disable that one, those two rules that we have. Might as well also clear my cache out so it's not giving me the same cache data before. Clear data. I want to make this a nice clean test. Sensitive data. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and disable these rules. As you can see, it is configured below, but we're going to go ahead and just disable them in this policy policy layer. Going to click commit to commit these changes, and then we'll deploy it. All right, now that that's deployed, let's go ahead and go back to, we've deleted all of our intrusion events. So I'm going to try this test again. And again, remember, we have a layer under my changes that basically says detect an event on this, but then we have a layer above with the same rules that are disabled. So what's going to happen? Are we going to get detect based off this or not? So now our fake social security numbers have come up, and let's see what happens. No detections this time, and that's because the policy layers above supersede anything below as far as the specific rules are concerned. Doesn't mean by the way, it doesn't mean if you create a policy level above and you only enable or disable 2 rules, that means all the other rules you've created below are not used. It just doesn't use those rules. It doesn't look for those rules on the policy layers below, just the ones that you specifically define. So going back into this intrusion policy, I'm going to also talk about how we can look at the Snort rule updates, and based on that, we can kind of create a policy layer looking at what changes and test those instead of just relying on the default. So when you do a Snort rule update, and the way to kind of see where you update those, if you go to System Updates, there's a way to update and apply these rules regularly. I have them set to look daily at 3 a.m. and deploy the updated rules. But when those are deployed, they're deployed to this guy right here. And depending on which default policy or base policy you have, some of those could be enabled, some of them might not be, but it's really dependent upon that. So let's say you want to get a little bit more specific on what you want to have defined. If you want to, maybe there's something you don't want to just trust whatever this base policy is. So let's go ahead and take a look. I'm going to just delete this really quickly and set these sensitive data rules back on my changes, because I'm not really worried about that at this point. Actually, I'll kind of leave it as is. So let's say we add a layer, and this is going to be SRU updates for 3/12/19. I think that was the last major update. So give me just a moment. And pardon me if you guys hear any noises in the background. There's a lot of cars coming through my street during the day, and I'm kind of towards the front. So we've created a new policy layer, and this policy layer is just blank as it is. Everything that's defined is obviously below. So if we want to actually test out new updates, or we know that there was a Snort update that came through the other day, we can go to, on the left hand side, go to rule updates, and we can see what was changed, and kind of do filter based off of whether or not it was set to disable or anything that was set to block. Since we care more about what's potentially blocking traffic, we could just go ahead and filter based off that and set these rules to say, alert, just generate an alert. Don't block anything. We don't want to go disrupt anything in the meantime. So we'll just change that to generate alert in this specific policy layer. And if we want to look at what new rules were created, we could also kind of glance down here. As you can see, there's a lot of rules added. If I filter all of them, that's 1,258 rules. So that's kind of cool to check. If we're in this view, if you want to quickly change between layers, let's say we go to firepower rule recommendations, and we want to see the rule content for see the rule state for generate events. Oh, sorry, I should have cleared my filter up here. So here's generate events. So we can see what's set in this policy layer. Hold on a second. I'm going to clear all filters. I just want to see everything raw really quickly. So we can see that these rules are set below. And let's see the ones that are set above. Oh. I'm going to try to find some good ones for you guys. Yeah, so these rules are set above this one and above this policy layer. So these ones will be accessed from a different policy layer. So going back here, so we've created an SRU update policy layer, and we've changed the policy rules that would have normally been blocked down here in the base layer. We changed them to just alert. That gives us a way to kind of test this out before we commit to those changes in balance in the base policy. And once we're done with testing this out, we can just go ahead and merge, either delete this policy layer and let the base policy kind of take over, or if we can change it to block and merge it with the policy layer below it. Other thing I want to do is I kind of want to talk about some of the different things you guys can do with the actual rules themselves in a policy layer. So let's go to My Changes and Rules and pick a rule. So let's go ahead and I actually know a SID I want to test out. So this is going to be for just ICMP echo reply. So right now this rule is disabled in a rule policy layer below this. I'm going to change this state to event generate events. So this is kind of how you change a rule state in the actual policy layer you're in. And there's a couple different things you can do with it. So let's say if a rule is just the way it's set right now, every time there's a ping echo reply, it is going to cause a intrusion rule to trigger. So let's say you still want to be alerted based off of this, but you don't want to be slammed with alerts. So you can create event filtering. So you can suppress all filtering on the all events on the rule, but it's still, if it's set to block, it's still going to block. That's the danger of event filtering. Just be aware if the rule is to take action on this, or the rule state is to block and drop packets, it's still going to do it. So be careful with the event filtering and do it in kind of a logical way. Let's say I want to do a threshold. So a threshold would be how many alerts we're going to get in a set amount of time. So what a limit does is it gives you a maximum amount of events per time period. And a threshold would be if a number of occurrences happen in a certain time period that just counted as one event. In this case, I'm going to do a limit really quickly, and I'm going to set it to if there's only allow 5 events for pings in 5 seconds. Anything more than that, just don't even log it. So I set that threshold. Now I'll demo that for you shortly. The other thing we can do is, and going back to threshold really quickly, you can see here you can also track by source or destination. So if there's one host that gets a lot of pings or is attacked often, you can kind of track by that source host, or just keep it at destination, which is the default. The other thing you can do is you can do dynamic state. So maybe I don't care about one ping or one event, but I care about, if it's going to specific source or destination hosts or destination networks like my server network, or I care if the source is coming from this network, or I just care about it being triggered, a certain number of times based on a rule. So what we can do is we can change that rule state dynamically. Right now we have it set to just generate alerts, but let's say if it happens more than 50 times in 10 seconds, I want it to start dropping those events. And the timeout time would be 60 seconds. So I'm going to set that. So it kind of dynamically changes what's happening based on how many times this triggers in a certain period of time. We could also do the SNMP alerting. I'm not going to bother with that. And if you want to add a rule comment, this is for my labbing video. Delete when done. We'll click OK. And to see everything that we've kind of done, highlight that rule, click show details, and we can see that the threshold that we added, if it go up to 10 times in 5 seconds, and if the count is 50 times in 10 seconds, go ahead and drop the events, and it times out after 60 seconds. There's my comments, and there's the rule references. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and commit these changes and deploy that to Firepower. And then we're going to test this rule. I'm going to use a switch that's inside my LAN and ping something outside the firewall. All right, so that's deployed. Now we're going to go ahead and test this out. So let's go back to our analysis and intrusion events and make something happen. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and ping the host on the outside, and we're going to ping it first 20 times. As we should only see about, I think, 10 events, because that's what we set it to. So let's go. All right, so let's go take a look at what happened over here. If everything worked correctly, we should see 10 events exactly, even though we pinged it 20 times. Yep, 10 right there. Perfect. The next thing we'll do is we're going to test the dynamic rule updates, or dynamic rule adjustment. So let's go ahead and do ping again, and we're going to do the same target IP address, and this time we're going to ping it 1,000 times. So that's going to get pretty busy quickly, and you're going to see it start dropping right there. So you see here it should now it's starting to drop and change. It's now generating alerts and dropping based off that. And if I sit back and kind of walk away from the video and pause it for a second and speed this up, you'll see that after 60 seconds, the pings will start going again, then stop again. Just that timeout rate. So I'm going to mute my sound and kind of watch this on a sped up version inside the video I post. All right, I'm back. So as you can see here, there's a delay, and then it starts pinging again, then delay as it times out in that rule. So last thing I'm going to kind of walk through with you is we're going to go to talk about the shared rules again. Or shared policy layers again. I was just going to give you an example of that and show how inefficient it is, and kind of go back to that golden image idea. So give me a moment while I pull up my policy and create a shared policy between the two. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create another policy layer. And this is going to be just shared policy test. And to make sure that this is a shared policy layer, there's going to be a little checkbox that I'll hit over here. All right, allow share this policy to be used by other policies. We're just going to change like one thing on here. Just grab the first thing. Just say drop and generate events. Okay, so I'm going to commit the changes and save this. And I'll go over to my other intrusion policy to kind of show you how I could use that.
Okay, so let's go over to our other security demo intrusion policy 2 and show off how to add a shared policy layer.
So once again, we'll expand policy layers, and we can click add shared policy layer, and there's our shared policy layer from our other policy. Click OK to add that. And one thing you'll notice is that under the rules, I can't make any changes. So you kind of have to keep an eye on where that policy originally originated from, which where you have it configured in order to make any changes to it. That's why I kind of don't like using shared policy layers. It gets a little messy, especially have, you know, let's maybe have a intrusion policy for edge firewalls, intrusion policy for data center, intrusion policy for branch. If you have a lot of different intrusion policies, kind of keeping track of where that shared policy is kind of a pain in the butt, to be honest. The best way to do this, in my honest opinion, is to use a kind of like a golden template. So I wanted to create a policy that's, you know, golden template intrusion. And maybe I'll have, in this, I'll have my base policy that I like to use. And then I'll create the policy layers that I know that every single intrusion policy I have is going to need. So if there's custom ones that you want to test out, or maybe maybe you're going to add your Snort rule updates after you've tested them onto this golden policy, this is what I would use. So give it a moment while it goes ahead and creates that policy for me. And here I can have, like, going in here, I'll just add layer, you know, layer 1 through 8, right? Let's go ahead and add you know, we'll have like our one layer here. So we can create as many layers as we want for this, and, you know, define the policies, but this is going to be our golden template, the minimum configuration that we need on all firewalls. So we go ahead and commit those changes, and instead of applying this template specifically to like an access control policy, we could replace our base policy with this golden template. So give it a moment while it loads that, and I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to go through here really quickly and remove our shared layer, just because I should have cleaned that up a little bit to make it prettier, but let me go ahead and do that while we're taking a moment. Oh, perfect. I already actually didn't save that, so that was perfect. And then I'll go over here and I'll just delete it in here. So now that I have that golden template, now that can be my new base policy. And instead of having shared layers that I have to kind of keep track of where it lives at, the original shared layer lives at, now I have a golden policy. It's just going to be my new base policy. And if I need to make any changes that applies to all of my intrusion policies, I make sure that all my intrusion policy are using the golden template as the base policy. And then I go and change that golden template whenever I need to. So that would be like, you know, for example, if you have, let me pull up my whiteboard. I'm just going to delete all this. So let's say you have 50 rules that need to be custom rules plus the Talos base template that you need applied to all of your firewalls, regardless of what zone they're in. But each zone has their specific rules that they need to have. So like your east-west traffic inside of your data center might have specific rules that are more restrictive or less restrictive, and then your base ones might have different one. So you might have like a data center intrusion policy. You might have one for edge firewall. And then you'll have one for maybe like branch locations. So what you can do is each of these might have different policies applied to it, or specific policy layers that you want that are very custom and unique. But you want to make sure that they all have these custom certain rules enabled plus the Talos base policy. So you create that golden template and you put that golden template as the base policy for everything. So at least your minimum rules that everything needs to, for compliance reasons or whatever else, are applied to everything. And then all the layers above are just the stuff that needs to be done for that specific role that those firewalls or IPSs are in. So that being said, that was kind of all the firewall optimization, like intrusion prevention rule optimization I wanted to go through here. I hope that answers a lot of questions when you're, have this out in production and you're trying to do a little bit more than just having a base policy, and how to kind of, trim down and suppress or filter some of those events. So there, if there's one rule that's not, very noisy, you can kind of suppress that a little bit more. Or if you have, actually, that's one thing I didn't show you. The under the actual policy layers, I'm just going to delete this. The only other thing I didn't show you was under the policy or the rule configuration where you filter suppression thresholds. We did limits, so it only allows 10 alerts, something like 10 alerts for every 5 seconds when a rule is triggered. So if it happens 50 times, it's only going to show actually 10. It'll stop for 5 seconds. The other thing that we can do is under threshold, instead of doing the having 10 alerts in 5 seconds, what we can do is say, if it happens this many times in 5 seconds, only have one event showing in the intrusion log. So it's another way to kind of trim down, not necessarily false alerts, but so you don't have 50,000 alerts for, one for every packet, and you're just getting more of a condensed view. So that being said, I hope this actually answers some questions as far as firewall tuning, event tuning, things like that. Please feel free to check out my Pluralsight course on FTD. It should be published today, and I plan on doing some more. Or Martin Brown's as well. He's really good, and that can kind of get you the basics. That's on Pluralsight. With that, thank you for watching, and hopefully this was useful for you. I'm going to go through here really quickly and remove our shared layer, just because I should have cleaned that up a little bit to make it prettier, but let me go ahead and do that while we're taking a moment. Oh, perfect. I already actually didn't save that, so that was perfect. And then I'll go over here and I'll just delete it in here. So now that I have a golden template, now that can be my new base policy. And instead of having shared layers that I have to kind of keep track of where it lives at, the original shared layer lives at, now I have a golden policy. It's just going to be my new base policy. And if I need to make any changes that applies to all of my intrusion policies, I make sure that all my intrusion policy are using the golden template as the base policy. And then I go and change that golden template whenever I need to. So that would be like, for example, if you have, let me pull up my whiteboard. I'm just going to delete all this. So let's say you have 50 rules that need to be custom rules plus the Talos base template that you need applied to all of your firewalls, regardless of what zone they're in. But each zone has their specific rules that they need to have. So like your east-west traffic inside of your data center might have specific rules that are more restrictive or less restrictive, and then your base ones might have a different one. So you might have like a data center intrusion policy. You might have one for edge firewall. And then you'll have one for maybe like branch locations. So what you can do is each of these might have different policies applied to it, or specific policy layers that you want that are very custom and unique. But you want to make sure that they all have these custom certain rules enabled plus the Talos base policy. So you create that golden template and you put that golden template as the base policy for everything. So at least your minimum rules that everything needs to, for compliance reasons or whatever else, are applied to everything. And then all the layers above are just the stuff that needs to be done for that specific role that those firewalls or IPSs are in. So that being said, that was kind of all the firewall optimization, like intrusion prevention rule optimization I wanted to go through here. I hope that answers a lot of questions when you're, have this out in production and you're trying to do a little bit more than just having a base policy, and how to kind of trim down and suppress or filter some of those events. So there, if there's one rule that's not very noisy, you can kind of suppress that a little bit more. Or if you have actually, that's one thing I didn't show you. The under the actual policy layers, I'm just going to delete this. The only other thing I didn't show you was under the policy or the rule configuration where you filter suppression thresholds. We did limits, so it only allows 10 alerts, something like 10 alerts for every 5 seconds when a rule is triggered. So if it happens 50 times, it's only going to show actually 10. It'll stop for 5 seconds. The other thing that we can do is under threshold, instead of doing the having 10 alerts in 5 seconds, what we can do is say, if it happens this many times in 5 seconds, only have one event showing in the intrusion log. So it's another way to kind of trim down, not necessarily false alerts, but so you don't have 50,000 alerts for, one for every packet, and you're just getting more of a condensed view. So that being said, I hope this actually answers some questions as far as firewall tuning, event tuning, things like that. Please feel free to check out my Pluralsight course on FTD. It should be published today, and I plan on doing some more. Or Martin Brown's as well. He's really good, and that can kind of get you the basics. That's on Pluralsight. With that, thank you for watching, and hopefully this was useful for you.